Welcome to the Long Take Review, a film podcast with one eye always on the Oscar race. I'm your host, Jen Bankard, and I'm here with my friend, who surely was a friend in a past life, Antonio Elefano. How are you doing, Antonio?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm excited to be back. It's been a while, so I'm really excited to be here, especially with this movie.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited. So we are talking about the breakout indie film Past Lives, which, may not be on everybody's radar. It's only on my radar because I follow Oscarologists and movie critics that are like ahead of the curve in terms of what's coming out. And it's already got a lot of buzz. But before we get into that film, I want to do a quick movie news check-in. So Antonio, what's going on in your movie going life? Anything new? Any news? Any new trailers? What's going on?
Well, first I want to talk about there are a couple of movies that I've seen that I saw recently, and they're sort of in the same wheelhouse as I think Past Lives. So you at the beginning, like a few months ago, you sent like a list of like films that we were gonna review, and then we all got to sort of like pick which ones we wanted, and it reminded me of like being a kid and my family. We all got to pick a movie every week that everyone would have to watch, right? And so my mom and dad always wanted like action movies and suspense. My sister always wanted romantic comedies, and everyone hated my weeks because my weeks were what my mom derisively called like the critically acclaimed movie, and which just meant whatever sort of like odd what movie that would only last for 2 weeks in Beaumont, Texas, whatever happened to be there, we would go to it, and I would force them to watch it. And so there were movies that like no one else had ever heard of, or at least like most people that I grew up with never heard of. So anyway, when I saw Past Lives on the list, I was like, I'm grabbing that one. And I was so excited to do it. So in that sort of same vein, I saw Kelly Reichardt's Showing Up maybe a month or a month and a half ago. And Nicole Holofcener's You Hurt My Feelings. And I like, yeah.
How was that?
Well,
I've heard good things.
I liked both of them, but especially the latter. I think I admired Showing Up more than I loved it, enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. But I loved it. But what I admired about it was that it was very faithful to a world that I knew very little about, and showing all of its sort of frustrations and the sort of tedium of it. And it renewed my love and faith in like Michelle Williams, because we talked about that. We talked about her last film, The Fabelmans, but this is her in a very realistic sort of vein, and Hong Chow is in it. Again, a lot of the movie felt a little bit tedious, but sort of purposely tedious, and sort of recreating this world and these people who are very, very unusual and have chosen a very unique kind of life.
It's about the artist's life, right? In particular, yeah. Or sort of like a starving artist kind of figure.
Exactly. And so sort of the sort of frustrations of like, you spend, 2 weeks making like a sculpture, and then the person who's like firing the kiln like screws it up or something, and how that's just like an incredibly devastating, thing and how to express that without seeming like a crazy person. And just it was fascinating. Even as like I was like I enjoyed that, okay. Whereas You Hurt My Feelings, I thought was absolutely was wonderful and really funny. And I love Nicole Holofcener. I've loved her since Lovely and Amazing. Did you ever watch that movie?
I have not.
Oh, I adore that movie. It was my like feel good movie for years and years. And it's Catherine Keener, Emily Mortimer, Brenda Blethyn, this multi-generational family drama centered on these women. And I found the observations about these women, about modern life, to be really, really sharp. I find Nicole Holofcener to be like the cinematic equivalent of Laurie Moore, which is about as high praise as I can give to anyone. So those are the movies that I've seen. In terms of the trailer that I saw, I've seen at least twice, maybe 3 times, maybe all 3 movies that I've seen recently. It was Molly Gordon and Nick Lieberman's Theater Camp, which seems like the young adult like young adult comedy equivalent of like showing up. And it looked like a lot of fun. And again, an introduction to a world I don't know very well, but one that I'd happily watch for a couple of hours.
So I have seen that movie. So I saw it
You saw it.
virtually
Oh,
through I saw it at Sundance. Yeah, and it was one of my favorite films coming out of that festival. I managed to see probably like 8 or 10 films, and that one was definitely at the top of the list. So it's so funny. It and it I would highly recommend it when because it's probably hitting theaters soon if a trailer's out, I would guess. It's supposed to come out in summer, I think.
yeah,
Um, if anybody did theater in high school or even like dance or any sort of performing art,
yeah,
or even was like a stage manager or did anything that had to do with kind of like the performing arts, this movie really kind of like captures what that's like.
yeah,
And both the sense like the sincerity of like we love this life and
yeah,
we love being a theater kid, but then also kind of making fun of itself in a nice and balanced way. So it's yeah.
yeah.
And in a way that like surprised me because I feel like based on the premise, when I was looking through the program, I was like, ooh, like this could be really cringy.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to watch. I don't want to watch those kids being made fun of, right? Like I don't want them to be the butt of the joke. But I get the impression from the trailer that it really did seem like a sort of celebration, like a funny celebration of
Yeah. It's made by theater kids for theater kids,
there
basically.
you
So
go.
I think, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, nice. Okay. So since we're talking about trailers, my trailers for Past Lives were very confusing because it was like Blue Beetle, Oppenheimer, which I was like, okay, like that's just a big prestige movie, like no matter for like that kind of cuts across a lot of different audiences.
yeah,
But and then it was just like all big blockbuster action
yeah.
superhero movies, and I was like, why do they think I'm like the only person who's interested in both of these types of films? Like why? And but I feel like I'm part of a very small Venn diagram intersection. So like I was just like, and like it was so heavily leaning towards like big blockbusters that I was like, I just don't understand. Like maybe they just didn't even make a specific trailer reel, and I'm like, you're not even showing the Barbie trailer, like that at least is like has the sort of like indie wit to it or something,
Yeah,
it seems like it will.
yeah.
So yeah, that was really weird. I didn't understand. I was like, the people who are here for Past Lives before it's even had its wide release
Yeah.
are not going to be the ones who are like, I can't wait to see the Blue Beetle trailer. So but yeah, and actually speaking of superhero movies, my movie news, it was a pretty slow news week. I actually had to look up the Hollywood Reporter and Deadline tend to be kind of my go-to
Sure.
sources for just like trade news, and there wasn't a ton going on, but the big headlines seemed to be the box office that The Flash and Elemental, so two big summer movies
Yeah.
presumably are underperforming at the box office. They're not meeting kind of expectations for their opening weekends, which I feel like is. I was trying to think about like what does that mean? Does that mean anything? I think for The Flash, it's like the movie got overhyped and maybe they just overestimated how many people still care about DC movies at this point. People have been hurt too many times before. And then Elemental, I feel like the same thing with Pixar. Pixar is definitely on a downturn. Fewer people get excited about Pixar movies just because they haven't had a big hit in a really long time.
Yeah. It's hard for me to determine what alchemy is going to work for the Pixar movies. It's just difficult for me to predict. I mean, like my kids sometimes are engaged, I haven't seen Elemental yet. That one I probably will see. The Flash. I mean, I don't follow either universes, like either Marvel or DC, as faithfully. But I definitely care more about the Marvel universe. I find it more, it's always seemed to be the more commercially successful, but also the more artistically successful. So it's not a super surprise to me to see the movie underperform. The headlines about Ezra Miller probably don't help either. And also I think that there's some like multiverse exhaustion, and like there are places that are handling that better. And so why would I go watch The Flash if I can go watch the Spider-Man movie? So yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And I would definitely say if you had to choose between the two, 100% go see Into the Across the Spider-Verse.
Yeah.
I'm actually working on a written review for The Flash that starts with Tom. A teaser would be Tom Cruise lied to us. But because I actually had a fine time at The Flash. I liked it. Okay, like it's not bad
Yeah.
necessarily. It's especially compared to some other DC movies that I
Right.
think people agree that were not good. But it's also not the best book movie ever, which I feel like some journalists said coming out of CinemaCon. So it's somewhere in between. It's fine.
Okay. Okay.
So I think that's probably good enough for a movie news update. So I think we'll move into our main review now. So if you're listening to us for the first time, we try to do a spoiler-free section first in case you have it, especially with a smaller film like this where, I want to make sure we plug it enough because I think both you and I both liked it quite a bit so that people who haven't had a chance to see it can kind of listen for a little bit. And we will make it very clear when we are about to switch into spoiler mode and talk about more details of the plot and things that are happening in the film itself. So just to give a little context, because again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, this is a movie. It's not like The Flash where it's like, which has been in our faces and in the news constantly, right? Like it's not something that's necessarily on people's radars unless you're kind of plugged into movie critics. And so, this is a film that I first heard about during the Sundance Film Festival. Since COVID, I've been doing the virtual, they switched to having virtual screenings, and I've been trying to do those remotely, and it's been really great. And I'm glad that they're keeping those. They're kind of scaling them back a little bit, but I'm glad that they still have them. But this Past Lives was one of the films that had an in-person only screening. And so what happened was, it wasn't an option for me to see, but then all of these critics coming out of Sundance, when the ones who attended in person were raving about this movie, like, oh, this is going to be maybe this is the best film of the year. At that point it was like January, so it would have been easy to make that claim, right? To be like, it's the best movie of the year barely had started. But people were saying, oh, this is for sure going to get a Best Picture nomination. We're going to talk at the end of the show about Oscars prospects for this, but it had a lot of buzz. And so I was really eagerly anticipating its release. So it had a limited release that started June 2nd, and then it's starting to get into more and more theaters, and then a wide release will be this Friday. So if you're somewhere where it's not playing yet, just wait. It'll probably be in a theater near you soon. So Antonio, have you been also waiting for this to come out?
Yeah, I have been. I have a friend and a former student who is a huge film buff. He actually just got back from the Cannes Film Festival. He months ago, I don't know, a couple months ago, he sent me the trailer for this because he said that this was the movie that he was looking forward to the most. And as soon as I saw the trailer, I thought, well, this is exactly the kind of movie that I want to see, and exactly the kind of movie that I want to see in the theater. The last time that we spoke, which was months ago, was an Oscar postmortem. I remember one of my regrets was not seeing some of my favorite movies in the theater, like Everything Everywhere All at Once and Tar. And when people talk about movies that you need to see in the theater, they often talk about these big like action movies like Top Gun Maverick or like Oppenheimer. But I think, and I think that that's right. But I also think that like really intimate movies that rely on like a spell being cast on its audience and just complete focus on characters, I think also need the theater. And the classic example, a movie example of this for me was Lost in Translation, which was many years ago, right? The Scarlett Johansson and Bill Murray movie. I remember watching that I think it was in law school, and I was on a trip with like two of my friends, and we were like, it was a weekend in Vermont, and we just went to this tiny little indie theater, and we watched it, and we were all so spellbound by the movie that we went back to the theater, I think like a day later to watch it again. And it was just as magical. So I remember buying the DVD and then watching it at home and thinking like, oh, like it's not the same. Obviously it's the same movie, but it's not the same experience. And so much I think is reliant on you just really being with the movie and just the movie. And so I feel like Lost in Translation, Little Women was another movie that I feel that way. Manchester by the Sea. These are all very different movies, but I think they all benefit from that. So
Manchester by the Sea, I remember watching in my living room at home. And there were certain parts, and I was like, I almost wish I had seen this in the theater because I paused certain parts. Like, we're not gonna spoil Manchester by the Sea. It's a great but heartbreaking film.
Yeah,
There, you will know, you know what I'm talking about. There's
I know
certain
what you're
parts where
talking
I
about.
like just got so overwhelmed that I just paused and went into my kitchen and got like a drink or a snack, because I just
Yeah,
couldn't handle it. Whereas
yeah,
if I had been in a theater, it would have forced me to kind of like confront my emotions in the moment more.
yeah,
So yeah, I absolutely agree with this. And what's interesting is that, as someone who follows sort of the discourse around the movie industry and kind of like where movies and theaters and streaming and all that stuff, where all that's going, I feel like the narrative right now is that these quote unquote smaller movies or more intimate movies that aren't the big blockbuster, aren't the big visual spectacle, aren't being released in theaters nearly as long. They're kind of going either straight to streaming, or they have a really small window, barely in theaters, and then they go to VOD.
yeah,
And I feel like there's something that's being lost.
yeah.
Maybe lost in translation.
Yes, no, absolutely.
um but yeah, so okay, so this is great. I think we'll start with the short take, as we usually do. What were your overall impressions? Do you feel like it would have lived up to any hype that you had heard beforehand?
I loved it. I came in with high expectations. Those expectations were met. I loved it for all the reasons I thought I would love it, and I loved it for a few reasons that were surprising. Um, I don't think it's like a perfect. I don't think it's a perfect movie. We'll get into some of the nitty gritty in a bit. I don't think it's a spoiler to say like it's sort of divided into like three sections, right?
In fact, we should probably just like give a quick premise.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a good idea.
I realize we've made it this far. It's funny because like I think this is the first in-depth review we've done of a film that maybe not many people have heard about who
Sure.
might be listening. And so, it's like, oh, we're talking about Across the Spider-Verse. Everyone knows that that's a movie and like what that's supposed to be about, right? It's
Yeah,
about Spider-Man. So yeah, for this, I would say that the premise is that it follows this woman named Nora Moon, who immigrated from Korea to, it's actually Canada, right? And then she moves to New York.
yeah,
Um, when she's like 12, and she has a childhood friend that she hasn't seen, and so the film sort of checks in at different stages. I think it's like 12-year
yeah.
increments or
Well,
something like that, right? Yeah. And kind of checks in on their, like, have they seen each other, are they talking to each other, like, and just follows their lives in a way. And it's like they have this really, it seems like this really deep connection. It sort of like explores kind of like what that means, and
yeah,
what happens
yeah.
throughout their lives. So
Yes, that's an excellent summary. So for me, I found the childhood section maybe to be the least successful for me. Um, this is mostly because I find it difficult to believe in the roots of love being planted at the age of 12. Maybe this is like the cynic in me. um, but I did find something interesting in there that I do want to talk about later. But the second act of the movie I thought was more interesting, when they're sort of reconnecting as sort of young adults, but across a distance, because he's still in Korea and she is in New York. Um, but that section I think plays exactly how you think it's going to play. It like you I was like, okay, I know how this is going to go. I know how this is going to end. Um, but it's the third act. It's that
mm,
last part of the movie when 12 years after that to me has so many payoffs and is so rich, and where this movie I think really distinguishes itself from others in the genre. So I think it's a brilliant movie. I loved the movie. If I had one thing that I wish I could do in this movie, or in terms of spending time in the world, I wish I could spend more time in the later part of the chronology to flesh out the thorny, interesting questions of the film. Um, and I'm gonna talk about the end. I'm gonna talk about endings generally, not the ending of the movie, because we're not the spoilery part of this. But I think the thing about romances generally about movies is that a lot depends on the ending, right? Like when you're watching romances generally. What I loved about this movie was that it felt like so rich in its journey and so insightful about its characters, um, that while I wanted it to stick the landing, and I think it did, by the way, we'll talk about that later. I already felt at that point of the film that I'd experienced enough and felt enough for these people, more than I could have possibly expected. And that's a good place to be as a movie watcher. Like as a writing teacher, or someone who just reads like writing, like to me, if I'm reading something and there's like one moment where I'm just like, oh, that makes me think about something. That's like, that feels like an epiphany. That feels like, that's like an aha moment. If I get one of those in the course of like
Mm.
reading a paper or an essay or a short story or whatever, I feel like that was time well spent. And the third act of this movie, there were so many moments where I wish that I could have like taken out a pen and paper and just written down the line or the thought that came into my head. And I've been like, since I watched the movie, I've been so looking forward to like this moment to just like talk to you about it. Um, so I think that that's the measure of a really excellent movie, where it's just like, however this is going to end, I'm really happy. And it actually kind of goes with the theme of the movie, I think, a lot too. However this is going to end, this has been time well spent, and I'm going to be, thinking about this for a long time. What did you think?
Absolutely. So I think it's really interesting because my biggest takeaway from this was that the screenplay is so smart in laying groundwork in those first two acts with the characters. And for me, it was like a very subtle film until the third act, when it kind of snuck up on me, I feel like, in
Mm.
terms of all of a sudden I was just being like, the wave just kind of got bigger and bigger, and it was just like crashed in the
Yeah.
third act, and you're like, whoa. And all of these things that were happening earlier in the film in different conversations or different scenes really pay off in a huge way, and not in the way that you expect. And it's just, when that started happening, I just thought, this was so smart. This
Yeah.
is so smart.
Yeah.
And it's so self-aware
Yeah.
in a way that doesn't become cheesy or like distracting, because oftentimes self-awareness can become a displacement
Hmm.
for actually doing the thing. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, we're just going to talk about what we're going to do instead of actually doing anything. Whereas this had just enough self-awareness to be like, we're going to challenge the conventions of romance and challenge your expectations, and
Yeah.
kind of like reject and refuse the things that are quote unquote supposed to happen in a movie like this,
Mhm.
but in a way that was felt totally natural, which I
Yeah.
thought was brilliant.
Yeah, and you use the word smart to describe the movie, and I think that that's right. But I think that often when smart is applied to a romance, it's often because it's sort of like deconstructing, or like you lose some of the actual romance, right? It's less lush. You're less swept away by it because it's smart, right? Like that there's something about that that makes it counter to what we expect in a romance. But I feel like it's smart in a way that serves the romance, right? And that expands the definition of romance. Um, and yeah, yeah. Well, good, good.
And also just the performances were amazing, because
Oh
I feel
yeah,
like this movie has a lot of silence in it, and
yeah,
a lot of pauses, and kind of it forces you to kind of sit with the characters when they're not saying anything, and they're just kind of, and they're sitting with each other in a way that like they're trying to figure out, right? Like sometimes it's very awkward,
yeah,
and I feel like that doesn't work unless you have actors that can carry that, right? So like, and
yeah,
they can convey so much with just kind of like a shifting of their weight, or like the way that they're, where the direction they're looking in, or how they tilt their head or something like that. And I feel like this movie from start to finish just had so much of that,
oh, absolutely.
and so much visual poetry too. It's just like every shot. One of the concerns I had, because Celine Song, who's the director, the only thing I knew about her, I wasn't familiar with her work before this, was that she was a playwright. So this is her directorial debut. She's never done a film before,
Yeah,
but she has written a lot of plays. And so I was concerned with, oh, is this going to feel like a stage play that just happens to be filmed as a movie,
mhm,
right?
right.
Because we've seen lots of other films.
Oh yeah,
I feel like Women Talking, a movie that I loved, right, and we both loved, that from last Oscar season, oftentimes felt like, oh, this could very easily be a play with like just
oh for
a
sure.
bunch of people sitting in a room,
Yeah,
right? And so I kind of was worried that like that it would be all dialogue, no cinema, right?
yeah,
And that was like, I was so wonderfully surprised to find that it was the opposite. Every shot was so well composed.
yeah,
Movement and motion and camera movement in particular is so powerful in this film, and really serves the story and the themes in a
absolutely.
way that I really loved. And I was like blown away, because I was like, wait, if you're a playwright, like, why do you know how to do this? It's amazing.
Multi-talented Celine Song. Yeah, no, I agree. I think I'm less. I a movie that didn't translate as well to the. I think Women Talking worked as a film, but felt very stagey. Was like August Osage County, which is one of my favorite plays. But then the movie adaptation of it
Mm.
didn't feel, even with the caliber of performers there, it just didn't translate as well. And it wasn't adapted. Um, I think as well as some other plays. Um, all right, so good. So we're kind of on the. It seems like we're on the same page in terms of a pretty hearty recommendation for this.
Yeah, I think so too. I was also nervous, right? Because whenever a movie has so much hype,
Yeah,
I mean, The Flash is a great example. There's
yeah,
so much hype that you're like, how can this be, right? Like, I'm worried. I want to protect my heart. I don't want to get too excited for something I'm going to see and then be
yeah,
disappointed. And so that was definitely a risk because I feel like so many people. I had only heard really glowing reviews
yeah,
being like, we don't know how this early a film could be like an Oscar
yeah,
contender, maybe even some people were even going so far to say front runner, like, but it's happening. I was like, how can this be possible? And so I went in with like an open mind, being like, okay, like this people are saying this is great, but like, it might not be as great as it sounds. But so the fact that to me it was, and I think in the first act, sort of as you're saying, because it is a slow burn movie. I think this is a
it
good
is.
segue into our next section of like, well, who would like this film?
Yeah,
It's a slow burn.
it is.
So at the beginning, when you don't quite know where it's going, I feel like it's kind of easy to be like, oh, this is just like a quiet movie where people, like it's, I
Yeah,
don't know, it's hard to see the impact it's going to have.
yeah,
And then that's why by the third act I was just like bowled over because I didn't see
yeah,
it coming. I really didn't see it coming.
yeah.
um so we like to, before we move into spoiler mode and kind of discuss the film in more detail, we like to do what I'm calling the recommendation algorithm. So like, if Netflix is kind of recommending this to someone, if they're putting in a category, right? If you liked this, you'll like this. So who are we recommending this film to? Like, should, for the sake of humanity, maybe we think everyone should go see it, but like who is going to be the most receptive to this movie, I guess maybe is
I,
the best way to
I'll
frame
say
the question.
as soon as I watched it, I started sending texts to friends, but it wasn't to everybody, right?
Mm,
I think that people who I know like romance, who like insightful drama, people who want to see adults acting like adults on film. Like for years, I was a sucker for like any coming of age like movie or TV show, but now I have such little interest in the genre now. I don't know if I've just seen too much, or maybe I'm just old now, but I'm just more interested in the complexities of life beyond one's teens and 20s. Um, and so for me, slow burn is right. And so people who are film goers who are patient. With their romance, right? Because I think that it's right that like that romance is big and expansive, and there are lots of different kinds, and there are some people who like the sort of rhythm and beats of like a romantic comedy, and they need that especially the heavy
right.
comedy at the beginning to sort of get them through to the the inevitable sort of misunderstandings and the loves of, but this is the kind of movie that is very carefully constructed, and that will that where the characters will develop over time, right? And um, so it will again. I think a patient moviegoer will ultimately be rewarded, but you need to be patient.
Right. This movie doesn't have it doesn't have the sort of pacing of a rom-com or the tone, right? It's more lyrical and subtle, right? No one's hitting you over the head with what's happening, right? It's a lot of it's implied. You have to kind of pick things up
Yeah,
between the lines in conversations that characters are having. And it's also like a full life, right? So like I would almost in some ways it you can compare it to something like Boyhood.
yeah, sure.
It's not to that degree. Like Boyhood is much more extreme because it's like literally they filmed someone every day for like their whole life. You know what I mean? Like it's like
Yeah,
there's there's a there's a sort of filmmaking project there that this does not engage in, right? But it is like it's someone across their life, right? Like from their 12, like Nora's 12 when the film starts. She's a middle aged probably by the time I don't know if they actually said what her age was, but middle age by the time the film ends, and right, so like, and it's very expansive in that way.
Yeah.
So I feel like, yeah, you have to be able to kind of like not, yeah, patient is a really good way to describe it. And I would also say, this shouldn't be the case, but just being realistic, most of this movie, maybe at least 60% is in Korean with subtitles.
Yeah.
I would, like the great Bong Joon-ho, we shouldn't let 1 inch of text, right, keep us from enjoying this whole world of cinema, right? Like, so like we're advocating for, like, if like, quote, films in another language are not usually your thing, I would say try to, for this movie might get you out of your comfort zone in a way that, this might be the gateway movie potentially.
Yeah.
But I feel like, realistically, if you know yourself well enough to know that, like, and also, like, if you are really tired after work, right, and don't go see this late at night, and then, like, you have to read the subtitles and then you might fall asleep, right? Like, if you're that type of person, like, if you know yourself on the day, right, like, make sure you're in the right frame of mind to go see this. I would say it's not a difficult sit. It's not like one of those movies that's like tough to watch at all.
No.
It's just, yeah, it's just,
I, and I'll say a couple of things about that. One, to echo something that you said earlier, this movie is very well choreographed. It's like it's like a dance, and so even if you were missing certain lines of dialogue here and there, which would be a shame a little bit, because like the lines are incredible, right? It's the screenplay is amazing. I tried to find the screenplay because I there were so many lines that I just wanted to have at the ready to talk to you about. But I just wrote down what I could remember. But there's so much that's communicated by just their body language, and that also feels very universal in terms of, like, the anxiety and the nerves of, like, seeing someone that you haven't seen for a long time, who you sort of built up in your head. Um, Things that, like, all of us can sort of relate to, that plays on the screen really electrically. And so while yes, the movie is quiet and subtle, I think that it has a resonance that's unexpected. When I finished the movie, I watched it 9:20 in the morning in Glendale. It felt like like being at a film festival. I was like, all right, 9:20, you're gonna go watch the movie. Well, there were very few people in the theater, but there was one woman who was young woman sitting behind me, and she was just bawling. And I just looked at her and I smiled, because, like, I respect that movie. I love those moviegoers who go alone, watch, and just are immersed in the movie. And I felt the same way too, right? So yes, subtitles, but it's just, I think it's just like a universal kind of movie, like something that translates,
yeah.
really beautifully and really well. It's just really accessible, despite being very, very subtle and having a lot of nuances.
Right. And actually, the different languages, Korean, mostly Korean versus English,
Yeah.
the switching between those two is so visceral and powerful in a way that ties into the story,
Yeah.
in a way, like, in a way that I thought was great. And but the other thing too is, like, the story is very specific, and it is specific to the Asian American experience in a lot of ways, but at the same time there's certain aspects of it that I feel like cut across,
Yeah.
and, like, a lot of different people who see this movie are going to feel seen. Like you mentioned it a second ago, right? It's like seeing someone you haven't seen in years, and kind
Yeah.
of like the anxiety or the awkwardness, but then also the kind of like when you slide back into a relationship with someone you haven't seen in a long time,
Yeah.
sort of seamlessly, like that's going to feel very real. And then also, like, for me, it was like having to choose, like, prioritize those, like, kind of like crossroad moments in your life where you're like, do I care more about a relationship, or do I care more about my personal ambitions, my career? Like, what are like how your values kind of impact your life choices, and in a way that felt very real.
Yeah.
And so there's just, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here. And marriage in this felt very authentic and real.
Oh, yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Like that, we're gonna. I want to talk about that a lot, about the triangle aspect of this, and
Yeah.
what makes this a really truly, interesting and worthy, um, take on a device that's been that has been used, for forever, but that feels new here.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think the last thing, because it sounds like we're chomping at the bit to actually like talk about
Yeah.
spoilers. So the last thing I'll say in terms of recommending this film is if you are in a book club or you just like reading, like you like novels and you like sort of, what prose narration can offer
Yeah.
and just like, great language and, that kind of thing. If you consider yourself at all literary, I would say this is a must see.
Yeah.
And in fact, I did go see this movie with my neighbor and friend Amanda. Shout out to her; she's probably not listening to this because she's reading instead of listening to podcasts, as I should be more. But she the conflict she potentially had with coming to this movie with me was her book club, and then the book club got canceled, meeting got canceled, and then she invited people from her book club to come to the movie, like to come to dinner and to come to the movie with us. And two things about that. One is that everybody loved it. They were way into it, and they were like, "Oh, thank you so much for like drawing this, bringing this movie to my attention." And the other thing is, one person said, "I'd love to read the book this is based on."
Oh,
And I
wow.
was like, "I don't think there's a book. There's no book.
No
This is
book.
original,
Yeah.
right?"
That's high praise. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that said a lot, right? Because that the story was so rich and so full that she assumed that there was like a bigger version, like a longer version of it in novel
Yeah.
form. Go see Past Lives if you haven't seen it. This is your exit if you are now interested in seeing this movie, but you don't want it spoiled because we're about to talk about it in way more detail. So I'm going to count down from 3, and basically anything we say after that is on you.
Okay.
So mute your earbuds, take them out, right? Do whatever you have to do in the moment. If you're like, oh no, I didn't realize we are going to be talking about spoilers for this movie. 3, 2, 1. Okay. So
Okay.
now we can finally talk about what actually happens in this movie. But what I wanted to start with, because I think, again, because it does have kind of a literary feel to it,
Yeah.
I wanted to start with the rhetorical situations. This is a new segment we've tried a couple of times with PT,
Yeah.
where it's just an opportunity to kind of bring in things from our academic and teaching lives, so,
Yeah.
just any connections that we can see. And so I want to throw it over to you. So, like, what did you think of?
Yeah. So I did an MFA program at Boston University, where it was just like 10 fiction writers, and we were just all gathered together. So the moment where she goes to the artist resident, there's a moment where she goes to a residency, and where she meets the man Arthur, who will eventually become her husband. Because we're spoilers now, so we can.
Yes, you can say she's married. I kind of didn't want to say that earlier. I was like, I feel like the
No.
fact that she gets married is a big part of the plot.
Yeah, I agree. Even though the trailer makes very clear she's married too. But
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
one thing that I really, as I was watching the film, one thing that I really liked was I thought that Nora and Arthur are both writers. And I think the movie does a nice job of capturing how writers talk to one another, how careful they are with their language, how carefully they interpret one another's language. Um, and part of why I wish that we'd spent a little more time in the film's third act is so that we can see them as writers for longer, because we see bits and pieces of their writerly lives. Like Arthur wrote a novel entitled like Boner,
Yep.
right? Which is funny, but I don't really have a sense of what he's writing.
And no one talks about that.
No one talks about it.
Like,
right?
there's no mention. It's just you see a shot of the stack of books that he's at a book signing, and it just says Boner on the cover, and I'm like, what is that about?
Yeah, right. And Nora, we get a little bit more of her. We get scenes of her at rehearsal. I gather that her playwriting has to do is like as funny and wry as she is, and interrogating the Asian American experience in the same way the character is. I think, in
I got that sense too.
Yeah. So I definitely get a better sense of her as a writer. But in bed, they have a scene in bed together. I think it was after the first day that she spends with Hae Sung, and Arthur says something about how Nora makes his life. I'm butchering this. Big in a way that he doesn't do for her, that he fears he doesn't do for her. And it's a really revealing moment. But I have nothing really to tether that to, because I don't really understand their day-to-day of their lives or their careers, or how these two writers operate together. And I think that when two writers especially are together, there's a lot of room for volatility. And Nora even talks about like them, like this is also where we fight. And but we
Yeah.
don't really
Yep.
see any of that, any of those, and it makes sense. Two writers fighting a lot, especially if they're operating different genres or whatever. But so on the one hand, I believed them as writers. Like they seemed familiar to me, and the way they interact with one another, um, uh, I thought was really great. Uh, but but I do think that there's some parts that feel a little bit missing to me about their writerly lives that I think is important, because even like Nora's literary aspirations and her ambitions, it's sort of like a running thing that Hae-sung talks about, right? Like, but he talks about it in kind of like the most superficial way, right? Like it's sort of like,
Yeah.
well, when you were young, you wanted to win the Nobel, and then in the middle section, it was the
Pulitzer.
Pulitzer, and then the Tony. And I was like, I don't know. It's kind of interesting that the prestige of the awards are kind of going down, I guess. But you also get the
I
sense that
mean, that's shots fired at the Tonys, but okay. I'm just kidding.
yeah, kind of. But
Yeah, the Tonys seem too mainstream for her,
they do.
based on kind of what we know about what she writes about and stuff like that. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. But it also gets a sense that like I don't think he's read her stuff, maybe. Right?
Mm,
Like he knows that she's sort of a brilliant writer, but maybe doesn't actually know her writing. And it seems like a really big part of her. And I don't know, maybe he does, and it's just not part of the and
but that's part of the point of the film too, is that she is a different person, right? Like the person that with him she is a not totally different. That's overstating things, but she is a different person and relates to the world in a different way with him than
absolutely.
she does with everybody else, or at least and I think part of that is a geographical or cultural divide, right? Because and language divide too, right? Like the way that she can say things in Korean that seems like she can't say in English, and vice
Yeah.
versa.
Yeah.
And so like so it kind of makes sense that they're, and I think a big part of this movie is with different people we have different selves,
Yeah.
and that there might be and I think Arthur actually says at one point, I feel like there's a part of you that I will never be able to understand or never be able to get access or get to, right? And
Right.
that's why he's trying to learn Korean, because he's like, I want to be able to know all of you.
That's right.
And then he figures out that he can't anyway, right? Like even
Right.
if he
I remember that. That stems from when he reveals to her that when she dreams in Korean.
right.
Right. And that's, like another interesting, like I had written all these notes, and I didn't even write that moment down. And that's another really interesting observation. Right. So, yeah. So what about you in terms of the rhetorical situation? What did you take away?
For me, it was really kind of what we alluded to without trying to spoil it earlier in talking about how it deals with romance and kind of how it's redefining romance. And so in the first year writing course that both you and I probably don't currently, but have at some point taught at USC, the big part of the curriculum is critical thinking, and part of a big part of teaching critical thinking is getting students to get out of binaries, right? To be like, it's not this is the best or the worst, or it's not like, yes, this is always true and no, this is never true, right? Like, which is kind of naturally what they come to the class with, because they've been, part of that standardized testing, part of it's just kind of maturity, right? Part of it's that they think that they have to, that you are more persuasive the more definitive you are, right? Which is not true for good writers. And so I feel like this film is such a good example. Like if I were to teach writing 150 again at some point, I probably would want to show this film and talk about, okay, like what is the thesis of this film?
Mm-hmm.
And and then inevitably whatever you came up with, it would be very complex, right? Because it's not like, and it frames that in a binary choice, right? Like she can either go with Hae-sung or stay with Arthur,
Yeah.
right? Which life, which world, which person is she going to choose? And but the film wholly rejects that as even like a
Really.
sensical premise,
Yeah.
right? Which I love, and it's really wallows in the gray and the complexity and the duality of her life, right? Where it's like both, and that ending scene, which I know we're going to talk about in more detail probably in a few
Yeah.
minutes, but like
Oh, yeah.
that ending scene where she both knows that she does not want to go with him, right? It's not the rom-com like split decision, let me run off with you, like I'm gonna chase you at the airport, like we've seen that so many times in other movies, right? So she, on the one hand, she knows that the life she has chosen is the life she wants, but then she also cries after he leaves.
Yeah.
And the fact that both of those things can be true, that she made the right choice for her but still can be kind of mourning what she didn't choose,
Yeah.
I thought was just so beautiful, right? Because it's like so true of so many things in life where it's like it's not one or the other, it's not clear cut, right? It's not like right or wrong, it's just kind of like you make a choice.
That's right.
And like and
I
so yeah, that to me was kind of like, in terms of we're thinking about how this film is constructed rhetorically, it really never lets you entertain the idea that she can choose one or the other, and that's it.
That's right. Right. I mean, the trailer for the movie includes this monologue from Arthur, from her husband, where he's even sort of like summarizing their sort of situation, right? And I think he even calls himself the sort of like evil white husband who's in the way of
Yes.
you, right? Um, and I think that the like the part of I think the whole reason that the third act is as rich as it is because they gave that character, they made that character not an obstacle, right? Who typically would be, right, in a lesser movie, but they gave him agency, a worthy perspective. They gave him flaws, but also unmistakable virtues. It's what makes the ending as devastating and correct, I think, as an ending as it is because of what they did with that character, what they did with Arthur, and how Arthur brought out um, the parts of like Nora and also Hey Song
Right.
were really interesting and that felt really real. So much focus. You expect the focus because you're from the beginning of the movie. You're watching these two, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as Hey Sung is introduced to Nora and Arthur's lives, it leads um, to a series of very believable challenges between Nora and Arthur, like in this very short amount of time. Um, and I kept watching these things. I watched it with my wife. I watched it with Janine, and and thinking like these are really difficult tests that Arthur has to endure here. Like there are lots of points where I was just like, and again, because like you're watching writers, figure each other out and listening to their language. The wrong word in the ear of a writer could feel like a bomb. Um, and I felt like Arthur passed like every single test.
Mm.
And even Hae Sung realizes it in one of the sort of sadder observations in the film when he's like, I didn't know how hard it would be to like your husband, right?
Yes. That was
That's
such a good line.
this isn't a movie about a good guy versus a bad guy. Um, what I loved about this was that everyone's good, but not everyone's going to end up totally happy, and that's often the way life goes. And that that felt nice.
Yeah.
That felt like something that is worthy of us having like a long conversation about. So yeah, I
And
love
I also love how Arthur, he gets to have feelings, right?
Yeah,
He gets to be jealous and
right.
insecure,
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean he like lashes out or tries to undermine or like
absolutely.
yells at Nora, like all the stereotypical things that we would predict in a movie
Yeah,
that would be that we thought was a romance or like whatever, right? Like if he is
yeah,
the villain,
yeah,
those are the things that he would do. But he gets to do that and also just acknowledge like, I have no right to get angry at this situation.
yeah,
And but then he also like, because I think the fact that they're both writers, and sometimes I can't think of an example right now, but sometimes in fictional narratives, making your main character a writer can kind of be eye rolly, where it's like, okay, like we get it, like you're so the life of the mind, it's so hard, right? Because like
yeah,
um but this I feel like was very functional for telling the story, because by making these two characters writers, they have knowledge of tropes,
yeah,
and in a way that make that actually that's the vocabulary they use to talk through this problem, right? Where he's
Yeah.
like, because Arthur's like, this feels so big. Like this story is so, like, he's almost like talking about romance with a capital R, right? Where
Yeah.
he's like, if I were writing a story, this like, right, this is like your life is writing itself, like between the two of you, right? Like there's,
Yeah.
it's so romantic, right?
Yeah.
It's so sweeping, it crosses oceans, right? It's like, it's so dramatic that you are drawn to each other like this, right? And that you have this kind of this rapport and chemistry or whatever, right? Like, and he's like, who am I to stand in the way of that, right? Like that would make me the bad guy, right, in a traditional story. And so that it gives them the framework through which to kind of like engage with their issues in a more complex way, which is great.
Yeah. Now, Jen, I want to talk about, I want to go back to the beginning of the movie, to the first third of the movie. Because yeah, as I alluded, I'm not, I didn't love the opening third of the movie as much as the rest. Um, and because I don't know, I mean, I maybe it's ungenerous to say that this is like the sort of seeds of young love, because Nora's clearly not in love. Like when she leaves, like one of them is infatuated clearly, and one of them isn't. But it does. So I guess it's the seed in as much as like it spurs him to reconnect with her later on in life. But to me, the second act of the movie is really where they start to like, their connection becomes more sort of romantic. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but but one sort of really interesting thing I thought was Nora's parents, when they know that they're about to immigrate and leave, and they know that these two are very close. Nora's parents, who are artists, right? One of them's an artist. The mother's an artist.
Yeah, one's a director and one's an artist, I think.
Right. Um, the the mother tells the mother of Haesung, as they're watching them play, they like, oh, you're gonna have a date, like we're gonna have you have a date, and they're having this moment, and then the mother says like, oh, she tells the mother of Haesung like, oh, we're about to move, we're about to immigrate, but but we wanted Nora to have a nice memory, so we just did this, which is so messed up, right? Because like,
Yes.
yeah, for Nora,
It's a
I
strange
guess
choice.
it's a really strange choice, but it's the kind of thing that like artists do, right? Like you can imagine an artist like, I want you to have like, I want to manufacture this moment. You'll have this nice moment and you'll be able to remember it. And then that will be that. And then we can just move on and whatever. But clearly it's just like a dagger in poor Haesung's sort of heart, right? But so to me, that was the most interesting moment in that first third. Not this feeling of like they're in love and this is the beginning of love, but just like, this is a weird choice, and it's gonna this is, and I guess it's sort of, it does plant the seed in his head at least, and it leads to the second part. So fine, but what did you think? Did you think that it seems like you think it was as strange as I did, but kind of in a great way, right?
It is strange. So I think this is the only part of the film that feels like a means to an end
Yeah,
to me,
yeah,
because I feel like the main purpose of all of that first act is to just establish their relationship and kind of their characters in a way so that it's more powerful when we see them as adults, to be like, oh wow, in a lot of ways they're like interacting with each other exactly the same way they did 12 years ago or whatever, right? In a way that's kind of uncanny and eerie, and then feeds into this like this like myth of their destiny and romance, right? But then at the same time, it's I think if I were to rationalize it from a storytelling perspective,
sure.
it would, not that I need to or should or something, but if I were to, I think what I would say probably is that it creates this sliding door moment that haunts the rest of the film, right? Of like what could have been.
Yeah,
Because
okay.
and I think Haesung actually says this, right? Because
Yeah,
like, and I think if they don't go on that date, the sliding door isn't really open. You know what I mean? Like it's like, it
yeah.
doesn't, their friendship, which may have had kind of crush tension, doesn't
Mhm.
actually realize itself
Yeah,
until that date, right? Because that's the only time we see like she's like falls asleep on him in the car, they're holding hands, right? Like that's
yeah,
the only before that you could just sort of say that they're like two kids that hung out with each other, right, in school
right.
or something like that, right? And so I think it pushes their relationship to the extent 12-year-olds can have relationships, it pushes their relationship in a way that kind of like creates this what if
Yeah.
feeling between the two of them, right?
Yeah.
In a way that wouldn't otherwise. It's haunting for us because
Yeah.
it creates this like mystique, but then
Yeah.
it's also haunting for them because it's arguably what makes Haesung reach out to her on Facebook or whatever it
I
is,
agree.
like
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
fake social media platform they're using, right? For the I didn't actually see what it was called. Just like legally uh not suable version of Facebook. And arguably if he doesn't have that feeling of what could have been, or like this lack of closure because they went on a date and then she left,
Yeah.
right? If he doesn't have that, arguably he doesn't go looking for her on the internet 12
Yeah.
years later, right? But
Yeah.
I agree from like a parenting perspective.
Yeah.
Like it's a choice for sure.
I would be
And
if I were Haesung's mom, I would be furious if that was like the reason. It's like, oh, you wanted your daughter to just have like a nice thing before you broke my son's heart. Like, but yeah,
right. And almost like it feels like the terms of like they weren't on the same page.
yeah,
Like almost like like I don't want to say deceit, but under false pretenses, right? That
yeah,
this date was set up because
yeah,
you feel like it's like if they weren't leaving like the next week or whatever,
yeah.
you might assume that this is like the beginning of a formal courtship, right? Because they're chaperoning the two moms are chaperoning the kids,
Yeah.
right? Which is weird. I thought was weird because I was like, well, like they walk home from school alone every day. Like what? like how is that? How is that okay? But then they go to like the park and you have to sit like 10 feet from them. Like I don't know. Her reaction, while very polite, definitely indicates of like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Like I thought that we were starting something, not that this was like a one-off thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I wonder if how much that ties into the part of the story that is about the immigrant experience,
Mm.
right? Of like ties to home and like, and I will note that neither of us are Korean American. We are both different flavors of Asian American, but like
That's right.
so maybe there's some cult. I would really be curious to hear if you're listening to this and like I'd be curious to hear if there's like a cultural take on that choice that would contextualize that more. But
I wonder, what did you think? So the second act of the movie, this wasn't in our architecture, but since we're sort of talking about when we move to the second act of the movie, right? And they've reconnected via whatever they're now talking on
their
Skype.
version of Skype.
Yeah, I think it was Skype. I think it actually said
Okay.
Skype. I thought that was fairly well done. That it felt, it felt like appropriately awkward at the beginning, but also exciting. I didn't. I had a hard time. I was wondering how long they were chatting before they stopped.
Before they cut it off.
Yeah, it seemed like they were. I would guess maybe at least a few months, maybe even a year.
Right.
Is
yeah, I would say, I was gonna say maybe a year. It felt like something as long as a year, maybe.
Yeah.
In terms of like the fact that it was so heavy for them to be like, we need to stop talking, and the kind of the implication that would be a major change.
Yeah.
In their lives, I feel like it has to be a long time.
I thought that was. I thought that. So again, I said earlier with the second act, I knew how it was going to end because they kept having obstacles of like seeing each other in person, and I knew that this can't stay. Like this can't grow if it's just going to be via Skype, right? And but I thought that the moment and they did a nice job of sort of choreographing when it was ending, because I remember it was dark in her apartment or wherever she was at.
Yeah, the use of lighting through all of those like Skype scenes were amazing.
Yeah. And just the look on her face and her expression, I was just like, okay, this is it. This is where it's gonna stop. So I thought that it ended where I thought how I thought it was going to end, why it was going to end. In terms of keeping the characters apart, there's a I don't know if there was a movie years ago with Felicity Jones and Anton Yelchin called Like Crazy. I don't know if you ever saw that, but that was
I did not, but I think I know what you're talking about.
That was another romance that I liked a lot, but that was dependent on keeping the characters apart. And that one, in that movie, the reasons they were kept apart just defied like logic. Here, I think that it made sense given what her ambitions were and given what constraints there were of him making his way to America. I understood. So to me, the second act also felt sort of like functional and like getting us to the third act. But I enjoyed more maybe than the first act, because again, that felt to me sort of like the seeds of like, okay, there is a connection here, right? The connections that you can have like as a 12-year-old, like, I mean, it is significant. Like, you're the first person you hold hands with. Like, those are things that are going to be seared in your memory. But like, in terms of connecting with a human being, like that's the first moment where I thought like, oh, these two could work, right? Like, these two have a pathway to a future. Um, I know that the next thing that we're going to talk about was going to be the final sequence. But before we talk about the final sequence, I think we have to talk. I have to talk about and I think you want to talk about it too. When they finally see each other in person in the third act of the movie, and you alluded to it, because you were talking about like how he was standing, and how he was moving. And but I want to talk about how he was dressed. It was like this, like, I think it was blue dress shirt, button down dress shirt, and it was tucked in very neatly, and these light sort of like slacks, and it was like he looked very like put together. He looked like someone who'd put a lot of thought into what he was wearing that day, and it makes
Just like
absolute
he was going to a job interview,
it did
not to meet a friend.
did like down to just like how well ironed like the shirt was. And like there were details that I even noticed in terms of like later in that evening, like the shirt was a little wrinkled in the way that it would be if you were out all day, but it looked pristine in that moment. But he was moving in a way, right, without words, without anything. You could just look at that person from a distance, see him, and say like, he's nervous. And like something
He was like moving. He was like moving his hands, like he didn't know where to put his hands.
yeah,
It was so awkward to watch.
it was so awkward,
In a great way.
so wonderful. It was so wonderful because I was like, I know that, I get that. Like I remember being that. And then you hear from a distance, you hear Nora's voice saying his name, and then you see her, and she is she's dressed in what was she dressed in? It was more casual. I thought her clothes were sort of like flowing in the wind a little bit.
She has a lot of chunky cardigans.
Yeah,
She's a writer,
cardigan.
and she lives in New York.
Yeah. But what I loved the most in this moment, that in terms of the choreography of this, and it echoes something in the final scene that we're gonna that's why I think we have to talk about. I want to talk about this first, is when she hugs him at the beginning. So it's pretty clear that he has like built up this woman in his head. He loves her more, right, in that moment. But she hugs him more vehemently than he hugs her. Like, he seems startled by the hug. Um, and I think it's a very human thing. I think it's because she's actually less invested in that moment than he is, and it allows her to be more sort of effusive and more physical, and to give more of herself, because it doesn't have the import that it does to him in his mind. And then I thought that was just a perfect, like a perfect reintroduction to these characters, a moment that we've been leading up to for more than half the movie. Here it is, and I thought it was handled really beautifully, and it echoes with the final moment. Before we move to the final moment, do you have any more thoughts on like that introduction?
I think what you just described, again, because I feel like what I keep coming back to is that this movie is so realistic,
Yeah,
and believable. Everything is so believable. Even if you haven't been in that exact situation, you're like, oh, I remember a time that that something similar happened, or I felt that way, right? And so for that scene in particular, it's one of those things where it's like when you're like hanging out with somebody, or you meet up with somebody, or you meet someone for the first time, and then you don't know, you're like, are we shaking hands? Are we hugging? Like, are we like, what are like, and you want to kind of, it's that little time delay where you're like, well, let me wait to see what they're going to signal that we're going to do.
right.
And I felt like that's what that was happening in the scene, where it's like he was thinking more formally.
Yeah.
And it's also because she's the one who's married, right? So I think he wants to make, I feel like he's also being very self-conscious about, because when he has the conversation before he leaves with his friends, where he's like, come on guys, she's married, right? And they're like, well, we know why you're going there, right? And so I feel like he wanted to make sure he was being
respectful.
respectful, and like everything was like on
Yeah.
the up and up, right?
I think that's fair
And
too.
that he wasn't coming across as like trying to pull something or whatever, right? Whereas she is just like, oh my goodness, I have wanted to see you for so long, and like let
Yeah.
this be like a I want this to be a cathartic, platonic yet cathartic moment, right? And so yeah, so I feel like that was great. Where like they
Yeah.
just don't know. Both of them had different ideas as to like how they were going to be engaging with each other.
Yeah.
But then the thing is, when that happens, when that precedent is set, that forever changes the course of how you interact with somebody, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Now we can talk about that final moment, because the movie ends with the two of them, on a street. So instead of saying hello, saying goodbye, um, and uh, they're so close to one another, and you can just feel, the magnetism, um, but there's still this unbridgeable distance between them. Um, and you sense that this time, when they hug, Nora is the one who feels more tentative, more uncertain, more um, nervous and scared. And Haesung, to a certain degree, has accepted that what he came for, he can't have. Um, but he's still, in this sort of amazing way, grateful for being able to close that hope in a really
Hmm.
thoughtful, graceful way. And this time it's Nora, who I think that the way that she reacts to this at the end, where she's the one who's more discombobulated than he is, that's how we know that she's changed and that they have changed, that their dynamic has changed. And I think, a lesser movie would have had them kiss, and I was so afraid that that's what was going to happen.
Yes, me too.
Yeah. And how many times does that happen? Because we love the characters and we love their connection, but the movie
And I
is,
think we're also trained from other movies and other
of course,
stories
that's what
that
happens.
that's the logical conclusion, right? Like
That's what
that's
happens.
we're conditioned to think that that's what's supposed to happen in that moment,
A
right?
kiss is happiness. Kiss is happy. Kiss is happiness. A happy ending. Um, but I loved them more for their restraint and for knowing that there was no real future for the two of them, and that a kiss would only make things worse on just so many levels. Partly also, Arthur is just like down the street. I
Right.
it was a choice to have him just sort of like waiting there. It makes sense. um like there's a part of me that kind of wishes that he just trusted and just like stayed up there, and that they could have had that scene up there, but whatever. I maybe a future life, right? That was part of the thing. Maybe
I
in a
mean,
future
I
life.
got the impression that it was far enough down the street. They walked far enough away
It's
from
true.
her
I guess so.
apartment that
Yeah.
like I don't think he could like see them.
Yeah,
But
I guess
that's
that's true.
neither here nor there. Like
Yeah. But you alluded to this. I love that when Nora walks away, Arthur is ultimately waiting for her, and I love that she allows herself to cry because her heart is breaking, but that Arthur still receives her with so much understanding and so much compassion, just as he has shown throughout this entire act. And I want to talk. We'll talk a little bit more about sort of like Arthur and these sort of moments in the film that show just how worthy a sort of partner he is, and it just solidifies how right everyone's decisions were, even though someone's heart is broken. Right? Like sometimes you do all
Mhm.
things, everyone does everything right, and someone still gets hurt, and that's
Yeah.
that's the way life goes. And I think that the realism of that's what's really devastating. It's not just this like there was just this tragic misunderstanding and blah blah blah, or the timing was wrong or whatever. It was just that just weren't this it just wasn't meant to be.
Right. And I think I really like your read on how in by the time we get to that moment that Haesung has already sort of like like his conflict with internal conflict has already resolved because his last big monologue is basically closing that gap, right? Where he's like, or closing that door, whatever metaphor you want to use. I think because he says to Nora, where he said, he kind of goes back to their childhood and says, like, what if you had stayed? And he kind of runs through all these what ifs, right? And he's like, we can think about what if, and then he says, maybe in the next life
Yeah.
is when we are together.
Yeah.
I'll see you then, right? That's arguably the most important line in the whole movie, right? Because that's him telling her this is not happening, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not this life. that we're
Yeah.
not meant for this in this life, like maybe in another one. I'll see you, and I'll see you then also implies he's not going to try to see her again,
Yeah.
right? He's not going to try to reach out to her. They're not going to, like, they might not even speak ever again,
I know.
right?
Yeah.
Because
Um,
he's decided that they're going to see each other again in the next life.
there's a there since you mentioned the sort of moments of what ifs, there was one moment in particular that I got another moment that I just really loved, where it's one of the few moments of tension between Nora and Haesung, where one of his what ifs, they were talking about how, like, well, you didn't want to talk, and then you met Arthur and whatever, and Nora very quickly and um very, like, she's very quickly is basically is like, you had a girlfriend too. Right.
Right.
And that ends that conversation basically, right. And it's part of what I love about Nora. But part of what I love about this movie is I feel like a lesser movie would have spent some time going through the, the finger pointing of, like, well, if you had done this and this is,
Right.
and that's just not that interesting. Right.
It would
And,
have been, it would have been a longer and real fight, right? Like
yeah,
like a heated.
yeah,
It would have been a heated argument, right? As
yeah,
opposed to like a more kind of like one
yeah.
and done kind of conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, like, you can have that thought, but let me shut that down for you because I've thought this through, and it's not worth our time and it isn't worth our time, right? There's so many more interesting questions to talk about here. So, yeah, just
I was really stressed out. So from the moment they leave the apartment and she says, like, because she says, like, I'm gonna walk him to his Uber, and they're walking and walking and walking, and then just how long, I don't know
yeah,
what the actual runtime of that at last scene was, but where they kind of just slowly turn towards each other.
yeah,
I was so stressed out in that moment because I was like, because I came into an existential crisis about what kind of movie I was watching. Because I was like, I'm pretty sure based on everything we've seen up until this point, this is a movie that would not have them kiss or not have her like jump in the Uber with him or whatever. Right?
yeah,
But I still was so worried about that because I was like, but
yeah,
every other movie would probably do that, right? Or like that's is that, because I feel like this is a movie that 100%, the success of it 100% hinges on where we land, right? Because think about, again, to entertain a what if for the movie, like, what if the movie had been more of the, like, running through the airport Love Actually, like, kiss, like, even if they hadn't stayed together or she hadn't run away with him or something like that, if she had, like, been like, wait, no, I love you, they kiss, and then she's like, okay, I'm gonna go now, right? Like that would have been so much less powerful and less interesting
yeah,
than what the ending that we got. And so that was the suspense for me, where I was like, I wasn't really worried about Nora as a character, like, will she or won't she? It was more worrying about the soul of the movie that
yeah,
was at stake in those last few minutes.
yeah,
But I'm glad that they did that, and that, like, there's a line that she says to Arthur earlier on where she's like, this is the life that I'm living, and I chose to live it with you.
yeah,
Right. And so I thought that was so beautiful because it was like, no sweeping romantic premise can replace the more like, seemingly mundane,
yeah,
seemingly less, I don't know, like,
yeah.
this movie has a very complicated relationship with fate and destiny and, like, the concept of a soulmate and, like, stuff like that.
It does, for being a romance, for being populated with where two of the people are in, some, like, one of the dreamier professions, right? Like, they're artists. Like, for that line to be her definition of marriage, is telling, and I think true to, like, what makes marriages successful, right? I mean, like, so yeah, I really loved it, and to me, it was a movie that, even up to that point, I was like, I already have a lot to think about. Even if you mess this up, I'm gonna be okay. but then she didn't mess up. It was the perfect ending for
And
that.
the thing I love most is that it's so consistent with her character, because they've set her up, like, she has some line where she's like, I'm not gonna leave like, I'm not gonna skip out on rehearsal for some dude. Right. Right. So, like, I like that her ambition and her, like, valuing of her career and making choices about where she's gonna live and stuff like that, and where she's going and who she's gonna be with, making those based on really, like, one of the priorities that she has in her life, uh for her kind of ambition and for her career and her art, right? And I love that that's really consistent from start to finish of the whole film, right? And that it's not, she's never, I don't know, criminalized for that, right? You know what I mean? She's never like, no, the film doesn't indict her for being like, oh, like you care too much about your how what's the word, I'm not thinking of the right word now, like how far you're going to get in your career or how famous you're going to be or how high achieving you're going to be, right? It never kind of indicts her for, it never says that that's a bad thing.
Right.
Which I
I love
really
that
love.
too. I agree. I think that her character is consistent, but she still changes. Like the character still changes, um, but in ways that make sense and that are
Mm.
that stay true to um, the sort of, you know, moral code. I don't know, whatever. But to who she is and who we've grown to love in the course of the movie.
All right, so we've already talked about this a little bit, but I did want to compare this more directly to other romances or other romantic films. And so to you, like, does this, because we've been talking about redefining romance a
Yeah.
lot
Mhm.
and kind of challenging the status quo, like how radical a movie is this in that front, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I had a conversation with a couple of friends a couple of days ago about how romances dating back to like Romeo and Juliet are often a result of like the conflict is a result of people miscommunicating, right? And just not understanding something or just like not getting something. What I love about this movie is it's a film where everyone communicates very well. Everyone is open and honest, so it's not a matter of two people just figuring out a simple truth that has eluded them because of just weird hijinksy sort of circumstances, but rather three people parsing through so many very complicated truths. And that feels new to me and interesting and
hmm,
worthy of our time and thought. It's the kind of complexity that novels tackle, but movies rarely do. And I hope more
mm,
movies um, can do this. And I hope that more book clubs will go to the movies to watch movies like this because I think that it does what a good book does. Like it will spur on a conversation. I'll be honest, like this is the first time I've ever had like I've ever done this with just a single movie, right? Um, and I was looking at like the run times of like the other ones and I listened to some of the other ones and they lasted a while. So I was like, am I going to be able to talk about this for a long time? And then when I watched the movie and started writing down my thoughts, and I was like, oh yeah, we'll be able to talk about this for a long time. Yeah.
yeah, there's so much that we're not going to end up talking about that we
Yeah.
could have
Yeah.
easily, right?
Yeah.
There's just so much in here.
Yeah.
um so we've bragged about how this movie embraces complexity, right? And doesn't fall into kind of standard tropes or anything like that. What do we feel like at the end of the day? Is this film trying to say something? Like, does it have a thesis? Or just in general, kind of what are, if it doesn't have a specific thesis, like what are some themes?
To me, this is a movie that expands what a love story can be and what it means, right? Traditionally, a love story is about whether two people end up together or not. And if they end up together, it's a comedy. And if they don't end up together, it's a tragedy. But Past Lives is about what it means just to love, regardless of the outcome. What it means to connect to someone, what it means to lose that connection, what it means to try to reestablish it, what it means to love when it's hard, when it hurts, when it's not going to end up in a romantic entanglement. And to me, the moments of love that stand out were not even honestly of the central couple. I talked about like the Arthur and Nora and their moments together. Um, those are the moments that stick with me. There was Nora came home after that first day with Haesung, and she told Arthur right away, "You were right. He came here for me." And that's the kind of thing that in a lesser movie, that's a revelation that the main character hides, right? Like,
Mm,
um, and it's a secret, and then he's going to get angry afterwards and whatever. But it shows the remarkable sort of honesty between them, and that I thought was really great. Now, another really interesting moment, contrast that with like Arthur, they were in the bathroom and sort of talking about him and she's talking about how attractive he is, I think, and he asks, do you find him attractive?
Oh, her
And
answer to that is unbelievable.
it's unbelievable
So
because
good.
because I don't remember exactly the answer, but she says something that that kind of like goes around the question a little bit, but it's very clear she's attracted to him, right? Like I think that that's obvious, but she can't say that exactly. So this is one moment where I feel like she kind of lies, or she kind of goes around what the truth.
Right. She's
But
not comfortable being honest in that one moment. Yeah. She says something like, well, he's masculine in a very Korean way.
yeah, it's smart as she is smart. Yeah,
Right. She's not, I mean, she's not like explicitly lying because I think every statement she says is true and sort of implies that like why she is attracted or how she's attracted to him. But it's
mm-hmm.
just really funny because they're like sort of backhanded compliments or like she's being like, no, she's like, I just feel like because, and I'm going to get this wrong, obviously, but like, just because we've been apart for so long and we've been, we've known each other since we were kids, like just there's an intensity, like she describes it in terms of intensity. I think she's like, it's intense, but I don't think it's attraction. And it's like, okay. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's a little bit of a lie,
okay.
but I think that that's the best answer she can give, right?
Yeah.
I think that it's the right answer, even though it's the wrong answer. But I think that it's as
Because
much
she doesn't flat out deny it, right? She doesn't say,
doesn't
no, of
matter.
course not. I only have eyes for you, right? Like that's like,
Yeah, and I think
that
he
would
would
be,
see through that. He's smart enough to see through that, and he would be able to tell. So I'm glad that she doesn't do that. But again, it shows how open and honest they are with one another through this really difficult, like really
right.
fraught situation.
Yeah, this is a romance for grown-ups. And I really love your point about communication because so often the narrative propulsion of a romance is like the dramatic irony like of like, oh, just tell them how you feel, right? Like, and then they either do at the
Yeah,
end dramatically or they never do, right? And then something tragic happens, right? So I feel like the fact that this narrative still has momentum
yeah,
even though everyone has emotional intelligence and
yeah,
expresses how they feel to
yeah.
one another and is not like shady in it in any way except for this one moment we're talking about potentially. So like, I think yeah, it's really great. It's really, yeah, it's,
I
and
love
again
what
feels very real because like,
it does.
and could easily not, right? Like there's a
Yeah.
version of this movie that is over intellectualized
Yep.
and self-aggrandizing
Yep.
and it doesn't have the authenticity to it.
There's a version of it that's just comedy, and that's just like awkward comedy, whatever. Um, but this is the version that we deserve. that The moment when Arthur, so there's a reintroduction of Nora and Haesung, but there's also when Arthur sees Haesung for the first time, right? Because he's heard about him and he's nervous about him, and then he sees him and he's beautiful, right? Like he's a beautiful person. and and you can just see um how scared and how just like, oh man, look at that. This is rough. But and he doesn't really hide that he's, that he wishes that something less attractive just walked into his door. um, but he still has the courage to go out with them, to sit at that bar, to be ignored without sulking.
I love how the camera gets closer and closer and then cuts him out of the frame.
Right.
I was
Yeah.
like, I'm like, he's sitting and then basically like shoots their conversation
Yeah.
as if they're the only ones there.
Yeah.
And you're like, but 2 seconds ago we saw that he's sitting right, Arthur's
I
sitting
know.
right there.
I know. I know. Yeah. Um,
Oh,
there's another. Sorry, I'm just going through these moments because I love, and I just want to talk about them. There's toward the, so the end, and then toward the end of this conversation, right? That Nora is now having just alone with Haesung, with Arthur awkwardly behind her. Um, she, at that point they've just sort of like resolved, like we're just having this conversation now. We're gonna talk this through. And she says something. I'm curious about your read of this. She kind of talks about how Haesung, he got that little girl in Korea who she no longer is, basically. It's a sort of like the consolation prize. And to me, that felt like something a writer would do, right? It's like an invention of a writer to make sense of a moment, to make an awkward situation feel nice. Um, and I'm not saying that to say that like I don't believe it or that it feels false. I think that it feels very much like something a writer will do and something that a writer would believe, and maybe even something that like Haesung will take some will help him to sort of get over this moment. But I liked that. Like it was another sort of like biggish sort of like theatery kind of moment that felt like it was sort of necessary. But it felt also part of her being a good writer.
I feel like that was as much for her too as for him, because I feel like so much of this movie, again, to this question of like, is there a central theme, or like, is this movie trying to say something? I feel like it is trying to say something about our own identity or our own sense of self, and like, are we one person or are we many people throughout our
Yeah,
lives, right? Like,
yeah,
and or like, can we compartmentalize, because that's what she's doing, she's trying to compartmentalize parts of her life, right?
yeah.
Where
That's right.
she's like, that person doesn't exist anymore,
Yeah,
that's not me. And I feel like part of the pain that causes her to cry at the end is that he does, because this is an immigration story too,
sure.
he represents a piece of her that she kind of has to say goodbye to, you know what I mean, that like sort
Yeah,
of
definitely.
that kind of died when she immigrated, but she still clung to a little bit, and now cuz she has to kind of acknowledge like, oh, when I immigrated, I became a different person, right? um and we can see that clearly. That's one of my favorite things about the film, is that the second we hear Hae Sung speak English, I was
Yeah,
just like, my mind was blown, and I was like, oh
yeah,
my goodness, like, we're in a different world, like, this
I
is
know.
crazy.
Yeah,
And I feel like it should, and just the tone of her voice and like the intonation that she uses and how dramatically it changes when she switches from Korean to English
yeah,
is just like, it's so stark
it
in the
is.
contrast. And it's just like, and it's like, oh wow, like, you believe that she could think of herself as like a part of her is now gone and missing, and she has to
Yeah,
finally say goodbye to it and acknowledge it's gone.
yeah,
So I feel like this movie has as much to say about like, they're, because it's past lives in the, in which we haven't even talked about Inyon. Oh my gosh. Like, I guess we have to do that at some point. The it's past, the title past lives, uh I don't want to say at the surface level because it's very meaningful in the film, but like, at the ostensibly refers to this concept of Inyon, of like, in a past life we knew each other, and then that's what's fating us to meet again in this life, right? That's the concept. I hope I'm describing that correctly.
yeah. No, I think that's
um
right. Yeah,
and and so it is like this concept of like, we have past and future, we have multiple lives,
right.
and that it's like a philosophical existential question of like, fate and identity and afterlife and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff packed into that, but I feel like it's also, past lives also means different phases of your life, and that really speaks to the structure that we've been talking about with the
Yeah,
film, right? Like, it's like these different phases of these different 12-year chunks of her life might as well be different people, right? Because she changes and grows, and like, and she's like each time she kind of changes something in her life, it like creates this sort of crucible where she comes out of it a new person.
yeah,
And then she can never go back, right? Like, on
yeah,
the one hand, you can fall back into the same relationship with a person that you haven't seen, that's from a different part of your life or past life, right? But at the same time, you're never really that person again, right? Like, you've
right,
moved on. And so
right,
that's what happens at the end of the movie. I think she
right.
realizes, oh, like, that 12-year-old girl doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah,
And I have to live as the like 40 something year old me.
yeah, yeah. I want to. Sorry, I keep resisting these big thematic questions because there are just these so many moments. But there's one more thing that I
But the
have to.
moments help get at the thematic question, so
Okay,
we're good.
the most audacious act of love of all to me in this movie was when Arthur and Haesung were alone at the bar, right? Nora presumably at the bathroom, right? And Arthur tells Haesung that he did the right thing by like Haesung is apologizing and saying like, I'm sorry that we talked just us, we won't do that anymore. And it's clear that his heart is a little hurting, right, Arthur? He paid the check. He's been sort of ignored, through most of the evening. Um, but he says you did the right thing by coming here, and I believed him, right? It wasn't
Mm.
He doesn't have
Right,
to
he wasn't just being polite.
he wasn't being polite. He doesn't have to do that. He understands him, and in the same way that Haesung sort of like likes Arthur, Arthur likes Haesung. Like despite it all, right? Again, I think that we have there's so many movies, and honestly, like real life probably also that where it seems unlikely that people who are in those positions can actually respect one another, like one another. But I think that something about this phase of life enables you to look at someone who maybe does have sort of romantic designs on someone that you care about, to look at them with empathy and with compassion. And that's pretty radical. Like that
Yeah.
kind of generosity in a love triangle that I have never seen in a movie. And again, it was awesome to watch. And again, an expansion of what it means to love, right? Because for those characters to show, I mean, I don't know if you call it love, but to show that kind of understanding for one another, and to be that accepting of one another, of each other's love for the same person that they feel that connected to, I think was such an act of generosity that I thought was just beautiful, and to me eclipsed a lot of the sort of like the lush romance parts of it. Is just that those people, the most unlikely of characters to connect, finding that
Right,
connection.
and they say that they have in young to the two
Yeah,
of them as well, right? Which is like never. I mean, like, yeah, I never could have predicted that at all,
yeah,
based on every other movie I've ever seen, right? So yeah, and the idea that no, we're all kind of tied up in this big story together and are just trying to figure it out. Um, it's really powerful. It makes because I feel like I would actually have been actively annoyed if this movie had made him the unlikable, you're not rooting for him, you're rooting for Haesung. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
and that's not even a part of this movie, right? Like, it's like, I never, at no point was I like, oh, who do I choose? Like, who do I want to win?
Yeah,
Right? Like, that's not even an issue.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, so I think, yeah, props to Arthur. He's a great character. And
Yeah.
also, like, okay, so here's a question. This is not really thematic or deep at all, but like, how much Korean do you think Arthur actually knows?
I think he knows a fair amount. Like,
Okay.
I think that he could like get around. Like, if he were visiting the country, I think that he could like get around. But I think that I don't. I think that he can get, like, in terms of the conversation that they're having at that bar. I think he can get enough of it to be incredibly frustrated, right?
Right, right. To hear words like that, he was like, "Oh, he just said husband," like, like they're talking about me,
Yeah,
and then they
I mean,
actually turn around and like, we're talking about you.
exactly. Yeah. Um, I think he knows when I think he kind of can sense it, even if he doesn't
Right.
totally understand it. Why? What is your intuition about it?
I would agree. Like, I think part of the film was sort of partly playing with this idea that, like, again, in a lesser movie, they would have that whole conversation and he'd be just like totally in the dark. But I think the fact that they've established that he over time has tried to learn Korean,
Yeah.
and that he says like, oh, like my Korean's like they talk about how his Korean's terrible, but then when he actually starts speaking Korean, his song's like, wait, actually his Korean's pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah.
um that I think that sets it up so that Arthur may even be an even nobler character because he actually has overheard a lot of their conversation, and he knows the extent to which they are close. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
whereas like again, in a lesser movie, that conversation where they're like cutting him out kind of could easily be like this like weird forbidden secret
Yeah.
thing,
Hmm.
like illicit kind of thing. But in this, it's not, and like even more so if we factor in that he probably is understanding at least part of what they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And he pays the bill too, right?
He pays the bill. Yeah.
What a guy! What a
What a
guy!
guy. What a guy.
Okay, so yeah, I think the last piece of this, which we've touched on a couple times but haven't talked about explicitly, and then I want to get to Oscar's watch, is
Yeah.
this a big part of this, as I said at the opening, this movie has so much in it that's universal and relatable for everybody, I think, who watches it. But at the same time, it is so specific to the Asian American and specifically Asian American immigrant experience, right? Like, I think the contrast between Nora as a Korean American, and then she says, like, Hae Sung is Korean, right? Which is
Yeah.
hilarious. Is a big part of the story. And so, like, I'm just curious, like, what were your thoughts about that? Like, how do you think it represented it? Was there some insight that we gained to that experience that maybe other films haven't given us?
I think actually in the course of this conversation, you've convinced me more about about that part of the movie being as integral as it is, because I wasn't quite sure when thinking about it. I wasn't quite sure that the moment that I remember the most, that I liked the most, was a line that she said about how when she first immigrated, she cried all the time, but then
Mm.
stopped when she realized no one cared.
Oh, yes.
I think I loved it, and to me that also felt kind of very Asian. This idea that your sadness will stop if no one pays attention to it. Um,
Well, and they established that when she's in Korea as a 12-year-old, that she was a quote unquote cry baby,
yeah,
right? And that
right,
Hae Sung just like watched her cry all the time.
right. Oh, that's true. You know, and that's true. That connects it too. That right, like that he was a person who would always sort of like indulge her, would sympathize with her, who had like empathy for her. That again is sort of the roots of that, because her parents definitely get the sense that they are not like the most empathetic people, right? Um, um, but it just feels like once we get to Nora in the young adult stage, she is like fairly fully assimilated at that point. So we don't get as much of sort of like the immigrant struggle, except for occasional references back to it. So I wasn't quite sure that I'm not sure that it was unsuccessful in any way, but it just that but I wasn't sure how central to the text it was.
Right,
But
you
now,
saw that more as just a part of the character as opposed to part of the story.
yeah, but you are convincing me that maybe that it is in fact more so. So please tell me more.
Yeah, I think it is, just because there's the break there's a parallel, right? The break that she has, but also the longing and
Yeah,
the lingering connection, but also kind of like almost like a phantom limb, like it's like a
yeah,
ghostly kind of connection that she has
yeah,
to Korea, right? Is I think one represents the other. Like, one is I'm gonna get this wrong, a metonym for the other, right? Like, Hae Sung is a metonym for her relationship with Korea
yeah,
in a lot of ways. And
yeah,
so the idea that only through reconnecting with him does she realize how much of herself has changed culturally, and
yeah.
that and linguistically, and just like her, even just like her personality, her taste, right? Because like I love the first time we hear her break into English in the movie, I think, is when she says "Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind."
Yeah.
And she says it with such an American. It's like Giada pronouncing Italian ingredients. Like, it's like, that's a deep cut for Food Network fans, I guess.
Yeah. I know
But
exactly.
like, it's like, it's the reverse of that, where she has such an American accent when she says the title of that film, and then goes straight back. It's like seamlessly into Korean. And but then also, like, then when they show Hae Sung going to watch the movie, right? Because that's what you do when you have a crush on someone.
You do.
You try to
Yeah.
absorb all their tastes, right? Like, I have plenty of mixed CDs that prove that, from college. But yeah, like, and I feel like the so the idea that she's being reconfronted with this person from her past, and a potential romantic person, the interest from her past,
Yeah.
I think is very much tied up in her relationship with Korea, because she's young enough when she's 12. Like, I feel like that's young enough, and I'm just basing this anecdotally on like people I know who were younger immigrants, right? People who were still kind of like of school age when they immigrated.
Yeah.
Um, that like that's young enough that you like don't really remember what it was like not being American. You know what I mean? Like, or you're like you're malleable enough that you just come out as American on the other end, and not as if you were an adult immigrating to another country. You know what I mean? Like, and so I feel like there's a lot of that where, and just the way she's explaining like this writer's residency to him, and like she's just like, and you can tell she's kind of overwhelmed, where she's like, oh, like how do I even go about explaining this to him? Like he's not even like, this is something that he doesn't, and then it cuts the other way too, because he's trying to talk to her about like why he didn't end up getting like he broke up with his girlfriend because he was too poor to get married or what, like,
Yeah.
and that's a very Korean thing,
Yeah.
or at least that's how they present it in the movie.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like, and then she has a hard time understanding that too. So it's like there's this interesting barrier that's geographical and cultural along with the time and the distance of their relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that you've mentioned it, there is a lot of his talk about himself is about is sort of like self-diminishing, right? It's about how he's ordinary. He has an ordinary job. He's ordinary, and he doesn't make a lot of money. And I don't know. I don't know. We could talk for a long time about like Hae Sung in particular, and like what he's actually feeling toward Nora, and what the roots of his affection are. I mean, yes, they were planted as a child or whatever, like that there's that, but there's something else about her that feels like um, endless possibility, and feels like realized, that feels like very American, right? Like American dreamy, whatever. That because like of the three characters, I feel like even though we spend a lot of time with him in the course of the film, um, like when he calls himself sort of ordinary, you kind of want to say like, no, you're wonderful, but like you also see like his life in Korea with like those like guys that he's always with, and you're like, yeah, that is kind of ordinary.
Right. Yes.
that,
Yeah, it's very broy.
Yeah, it's very broy. That doesn't seem like Nora. Like I couldn't imagine Nora at that table.
Right.
Like, right.
And actually they set that up from the very beginning, right? Because, and they never talk about this. I think Nora and Hae Sung never actually talk about this, but
Yeah.
she says, or maybe Hae Sung mentions it, but then she doesn't respond. I can't remember now. But like when she's a child, she tells her class, or she tells somebody, I'm I'm moving because I'm immigrating because Koreans never win the Nobel Prize.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right? So she's like, in order to realize this dream I have, I can't stay here.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that defines their relationship from the get-go, where she's the one, and they say this at the end, where she's the one who leaves. Right?
Yeah.
That's who she is to him. But then with Arthur, she's the one who stays. Right?
Yeah.
And so like
that's good lines too. Those are such
right?
great lines. That's yeah. You're the one who leaves. Ugh.
Ugh, yeah, I know, right? But he doesn't say that with malice, right? It's almost with sadness.
No,
where
not at all.
I think he finally realizes, well, like this is just how it is. Like this has always been how we are, and is that really something upon which to start a relationship? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. No,
and it kind of like
sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm just saying, no one says anything with malice in this movie, right? And that's an unusual thing, right? Because even though like
right, no one yelling. There's no yelly Oscar clip in this movie.
There isn't. Which I guess brings maybe Oscar watch.
Yes, you see what I did there?
I do.
Segue, the very inelegant segue. I've gotten very good at that. So we've already talked about, just at this like kind of tangentially, that this has a lot of Oscar buzz already.
Yep.
And it feels eerily similar to the conversations happening about Everything Everywhere All at Once around this time of year, because people were like, oh, does this movie have what it takes to run the marathon that is the Oscar race if you come out in early in the year, right? So yeah, what are your thoughts right now? Like, do you feel like it has Oscar potential? Like, is it as big? Is it as much of a shoe-in into like say Best Picture or whatever as people seem to think it is?
I hope that it is. I'm a little bit skeptical about Best Picture. I mean, with the expanded nominee list, right? With 10 slots, I think that it's certainly possible. But I do think that the Oscars have a thing against romances of this scale. Like when you think of like Oscar romances, you think of like big epics like The English Patient. And when I try to think back to like, well, what was like a smaller scale sort of romance that won the Best Picture, and it was like Annie Hall. It was like in the 70s, right? I think the categories that I could see it getting nominated in order of likelihood are original screenplay, um, best supporting actor, and then hopefully best actress. um, that's what I could see. What do you think?
I can't disagree with anything you just said. I feel like I'm more skeptical about it going all the way, but I'm not going to rule it out at this
Yeah,
point because
yeah,
I think it's so good. But
okay,
yeah, I think screenplay is the definite.
yes,
Like I'm flipping a table if like this doesn't get a
yeah.
original
And
screenplay nomination.
writers tend to be better about like nominating things that are recognizing these kinds of works.
Right. Yes, for sure. So I think that's pretty safe.
Mhm.
And that's kind of where it starts. Like that's our minimum
Yep.
that we're starting at. Then yeah, acting really depends on how what the competition is,
Yeah.
because I feel like a lot of these performances, since they are so subtle, and again, as I said, that we don't have the go-to Oscar bait clip. Like what clip would they even show from this movie? I guess is like for traditional Oscar bait. You know what I mean? Like I would have a hard time finding that because every conversation is so quiet and like
Yeah.
even mature and even keeled and not shouting.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's why I like this movie so much, because no one's shouting in this movie, and I don't like people shouting in my real life. And so like, but yeah, so I think the performances can easily get squeezed out for flashier ones.
Yeah.
That would be my concern.
Yeah.
So like, it really kind of depends on how things later on pan out. I see you have Killers of the Flower Moon, right? I mean, I would love to see. I haven't even seen Killers of the Flower Moon yet, right? It's not coming out until the fall.
I haven't
But
seen
like, I would love to see like Lily Gladstone and, and Greta Lee next
Yeah.
to each other
Yeah.
on Oscar night. That would be amazing. So like, but if I'm trying to think at this point, what's the main upcoming competition potentially? Like, if for Best Actress, I don't even know. Have we? Because the problem is that we also haven't really had anything that's currently competition for this movie.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, it's been a pretty, for Oscar movies, it's been pretty slow year so far, which is natural in terms of the life cycle of the Oscar award season.
It is. It is.
So that's not like a weird thing, but like, a lot more could come along.
Yeah.
The Color Purple could easily have a ton of acting nominations that like squeeze these ones out.
I mean, look, it's June. I hope that we have like a lot of great performances that we're going to talk about and that we're going to love. But I do feel like this is a movie that's going to endure, that I'm gonna remember very fondly, and I hope that some of these things will get nominated. I agree. Also, screenplay is the most surefire thing, but the only one that I feel very secure, fairly secure about. But I don't know. We'll see what comes in the next months. What we'll be talking about. But
I think it also heavily depends on if critics choose this as the movie to champion, because the campaign that this would need to have to get lots of nominations, I think, would need to be similar to Drive My Car, where it's like a strong word of mouth. Critics are like, no, this is the movie everyone has to go see. This is the movie you need to be paying attention to, and then that pushes it kind of into the conversation. So I feel like if the buzz for this sustains and doesn't fade, then we might be in good shape. But yeah, I would honestly love acting nominations for all three of them.
Yeah,
that's a big stretch, but the actor who plays Arthur is doing a great job. It's really hard to do his role, I think, and do it well.
it is. Now, would you put him in lead or supporting?
I put him in supporting.
Yeah, I think that's probably.
I think Greta's the only one who's in lead. I think Hae-sung, it would be the actor who, sorry, I don't remember his name. The actor who plays Hae-sung would end up in category fraud, right? Because he, in theory, should be a lead, but he would end up, inevitably, they would put him supporting, which is fine. But yeah, and then we'd have the problem of like, if there are two of them competing against each other, they cancel each other out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So we're not even close to there yet. And I feel like crafts categories would be the tough, if we're thinking about going all the way with Best Picture, and staying in the conversation. I feel like it would really need to be on board with it, at least editing, which it could be, but probably wouldn't be. Score, like those craft categories, I think it would be tougher for it to get nominated in, and so therefore, like as a long-term actual best picture contender, so it might get a nomination for best picture, but I think that's probably as far as it goes, would be my guess.
I'd be thrilled if it got a nomination for best picture. I mean, at this,
same,
even not seeing all of these heavy hitters that are about to come, it feels like a very special movie, and yeah, and one that I was just incredibly excited to talk to you about. So I'm glad that we finally got to do it.
Yay! Yeah, so I have. This has been so great. I was like, I need to talk to somebody about this movie in more detail. So I'm glad we got a chance to really unpack this film. If you're still listening and you haven't seen this movie, I don't know what you're doing. Like, I guess just. Like, if I don't know, like, I feel like if you are listening and you haven't seen this, you probably don't need more convincing. You're probably just like politely finishing this podcast, and then you're going to go watch the movie, hopefully. And I know, so we're going to wrap things up. I know that, I'm very impressed that you don't have a social media presence. And I'm actually a little envious, because I'm sure you're using your time a lot of the time much more wisely than I am. But is there anything any projects you'd like to plug, or anything else you want to mention to listeners?
I have nothing to plug. I'll take the opportunity to plug a former student and a close friend of mine. His name's Dan Toomey. He works at Morning Brew. He makes the most hilarious videos about the business world. I love his stuff. You can find him at DH Toomey, Tommey, on Instagram and Twitter.
Fantastic. That sounds, I might check that out. That sounds really funny.
Yeah, he's great.
And you can find me at Sopchockchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI on Instagram, and Qui-Gon Jen on Letterboxd. And thanks again, Antonio. This was absolutely wonderful. And thanks everyone for listening. Thank you for listening. You can follow The Long Take on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive reviews of films with Oscar buzz, as well as new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.